The context window is arguably the scarcest resource in AI today, but we don't seem to manage it well. In fact, that's probably why we have a new discipline called context engineering to address this. Today, when we build a context window, we focus on concepts, objects, and nouns predominantly. Now, these concepts, they pin meaning, which is absolutely critical, but the missing link isn't more concepts or more data. It's actually being able to capture the rules, the policies that run the business and get those things into the context window. We believe that policies need to be first-class citizens in the context window. And here's the challenge, John, when we're thinking about agents. We see a world where in every enterprise, we're going to have hundreds, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of agents. And if we don't figure out how to do this well, then these agents that consume the context window are going to cause us a lot of problems. Welcome to the Agentic Mesh Podcast. My name is Eric Broda in Toronto, Canada.
And I'm John Miller in San Francisco.
And today's topic is policies and their related decision boundaries as first-class citizens in context engineering, John.
Okay, well, you know how I like to set it up with a bit of definitions up front. Please anchor us in something that makes sense that we can follow along with.
Sure. Well, why don't we start with this thing we call the context window? This is the thing we're actually trying to optimize for. So let's just set the backdrop a bit. When an agent uses an LLM, we guide that agent with what we call a context window. That context window tries to address or provide information related to the user request. Why do we need that? Because the LLM that the agent uses is frozen in time when it got trained. So the agent and the LLM does not know anything about your business. So we use this context window to populate it with information about your business, or at least things that we think are related to addressing the request that the user has. Here's the challenge and why this is such a difficult issue to deal with. As I mentioned, it's a scarce resource. We only have a certain amount of characters, or more specifically, tokens, a token budget, and the token being roughly 4 characters. A word is probably the simplest way to look at. We have a limited context window, a limited token budget that we can actually use. If you're using ChatGPT 5.2, for example, the latest and greatest release, you probably have about 192K of context tokens in your context window. Other models may be a little bit lower, a little bit higher, but bottom line is the stuff that we want to put into that context window could span the corpus of the enterprise, terabytes, maybe petabytes, depending on how big your enterprise is. And we got to figure out which tiny subset of that information actually goes into the context window to address the request the user has. So this is obviously a really big challenge. Now, how do we do this today? Today, we use techniques like RAG, Retrieval, Augmented generation. And I'm going to paint this perhaps in too harsh a light. There are techniques that are actually quite effective, but what they do is they chunk the corpus, take little pieces of that huge set of information. They chunk it, put it into things typically like a vector database or a knowledge graph. And then when your user request comes in, we retrieve the top chunks, if you will, the top passages that we think are particularly relevant. So obviously, when we try and retrieve that information and all we're getting is concepts, nouns, objects, which are the easiest things to find in your corpus, which is probably why they're there. If we only populate it with concepts, then we're missing that fundamental capability and that fundamental set of information around how the business actually runs. So that's kind of some really basic definitions around the what a context window is, some of the challenges that we actually have with them.
Okay, so you said a lot there that makes sense. I think it's useful to point out that we're talking about corporate knowledge, right? And so this is stuff that the LLM was never trained on, right? It knows what a policy is. And I'm sure on the internet, there's a lot of policies, and it probably has some idea of how to, I dare say, think about policies, but it knows what they're related to. What it doesn't have is your specific rules and regulations, the policies that are the most important to your organization. And because they were never trained on it, they just don't exist. Now, it reminds me of the post-training step of an LLM because you could, if you had the money and time, you could actually continue training the model and fine-tuning it to your own policies if you had a massive server farm you actually deployed your own model. That's immensely impractical today for people to do. So, whilst, you know, we know that the original augmented generation solutions, RAG solutions, were really naive, but they've gotten better. And this isn't a podcast about how to optimize RAG and that whole set of work. And so we're not trying to address that. Just wanted to say that out loud. What we are addressing is using the context window, which is specific for every model. So if you're using Gemini 3, I think it's a million, maybe it's two. If you're using OpenAI, like you said, it's 192K, and you can look up the specs of the model, and it really varies by the model size. So if you're trying to use an open source model or some other smaller language model, it'll have even less context. And so, regardless of what problem you're trying to solve, knowing about the context window and thinking about it deeply is what we're seeing everybody do in the industry. And so, when we started talking about this, I think that's the key takeaway here is let's think about policies and other forms of constraints as first class context. And so, yeah, no, I think that's how I'm thinking about it anyway.
Absolutely. So I think, what we probably should go back to the second definition is what is a policy, or I said decision boundary. So
Yeah.
so I want to do two things. I want to give you the definition. I want to hopefully try and run through an example. Um, so a policy is a record of a decision that would be made in a business. Typically, it's a decision perhaps within a business process flow or something like that. There's several different types of policies or decision boundaries. There's preconditions. What needs to be true before something can actually occur? What are required actions? So what happens next after something previous occurs? There's branches, if then else. So if this step finished and this condition is true, do branch A versus branch B. There's obviously exceptions. If something did not occur, I want to raise a flag and do something different. There's also overrides. Perhaps when an exception occurs and an over, the normal default action would be the process stops, but perhaps there's an override and the executive says, oh, we can actually move this thing forward, and they override the exception. There's scope-based decision boundaries based off of the product that may be in use, the jurisdiction, the regulatory jurisdiction, or the risk profile of a customer. All those things are related. So here's the thing, and why this is so crucial. These are the fundamental decisions that govern how a business operates. So we have fancy terms for policies. We can call them decision boundaries, but fundamentally they are about how a business actually runs, which is why they're so critical, because inevitably a user request not just does not just want an answer around what terms mean, but they're looking to combine, this is a request that actually may have some particular actions or decisions that need to be addressed so they can actually provide a suitable response. So they're critical to actually addressing the requests that users typically have. Now, the other thing I want to kind of highlight is, if they're so obvious, why don't we capture these things before? Well, there's probably a few reasons. One is if we're scanning the corpus, as I mentioned earlier, it's easiest to find the concepts or the nouns. So our predilection is to actually do the easy stuff and capture the nouns and the objects. The second, and by the way, that by default probably misses the policy. So perhaps when I capture the chunk, it has a part of the policy, but in the next chunk, it continues the one. In the next chunk, it continues that policy. So these policies may actually span chunks, which leads to incoherence when you're actually trying to retrieve these things. There's tacit knowledge. A lot of the rules of the enterprise aren't necessarily written down. How often have you heard that's just the way we do things? Now, it sounds like a trite phrase, but bottom line is that's a lot that captures a fair amount of businesses around how they actually run. There's a lot of stuff in experts' minds that are not necessarily written down that we can use. Nevertheless, if we had those, we'd get better outcomes. Some of that information is distributed across the enterprise. So these corpus may be limited to a particular scope, jurisdiction, or what have you, but the business process may span multiple jurisdictions. Those decision boundaries need to span those. So it can be done, but it's not necessarily easy. Now, I said I would give you an example, and I want to kind of come back to some. I'm been in the banking industry and insurance industry for a really, really long time. So let's bring this to life with a bank account open. So let's say Sally wants to open up a bank account. There's 4 typical steps. There's identity verification, obviously. That's the first one. We need to know that Sally is who Sally says she is. Then there's the know your customer. So now that we know who Sally is, we actually need to know their risk profile, what products they may be interested in. Maybe they're not suitable for options trading, but they are suitable for a checking account. We probably have to have some bank account information, an initial deposit to open the account. We probably then need to have notification. We've completed your account, and where do we send these statements? So there's a bunch of things that actually occur in there. Now, when Sally goes into the bank, maybe she doesn't have the right identification, or maybe she has 3 pieces and we needed 4. Depending on your jurisdiction, maybe you don't need that many. I know in Canada there, where I'm resident, there's some pretty strict requirements around identity. So what if I didn't have them all? Well, that would trigger an exception. Maybe, not likely, but maybe an executive in that branch may know Sally and say, "Yeah, I recognize Sally. She can bring the ID tomorrow and open up the bank account. But let's continue the process." So then we go through, are there any exceptions? Maybe you needed $100 to actually open the account. Sally only had $50. So perhaps there's an override that says, yeah, this is the rule, but we're going to override that and let things move forward. So there's a whole bunch of things in relatively common business processes that actually have an incredible amount of decision making, discretion that is given to the actual people running that process that is hidden, tacit, and perhaps it is written down, and more than likely it is written down in some policy documents. But you know what? When I go into the bank and when I try and do my transactions and such, they're not looking at a policy book. They're actually thinking about what they know. And occasionally there's a flag that goes on to the terminal that they're working on to say, do this or do that. But here's the thing is, while those policies and regulations are written down somewhere, they may not be present at the time of need when somebody's doing their work. Hence, we end up with tacit knowledge, exceptions, overrides, thresholds that even in commonplace business processes need to be captured in order to make it all work.
I think that's a great example. And I want to pick on one of the things you said. You've been using the term tacit knowledge. And I think what you mean by that is just what's in people's heads, maybe not written down. So if a bank manager has the discretion, is that written down? Or is that, like we do in business? Hey, come back tomorrow and I know you. So if tacit knowledge is so valuable, how are we going to get that in the context window if we're not capturing it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you and I have worked in many engagements in the past, and one of the ways that we actually try and understand the business and come up to speed very, very quickly is we do interviews. We do expert interviews, and we obviously ask some probing questions, but inevitably, as you start to drill down a little bit, what you're finding is that, The knowledge around how the business operates is localized in that expert's head. It may be written down in 6 or 7 different standard operating procedures, but it's all in their head, and they have the experience to know that when this happens, the rules may say this, but there may be a shortcut, there may be an override that I can provide that maybe not everybody knows about. Maybe it's written down in one tiny place in the standard operating procedure that not everybody can find. Maybe it's unclear. Well, it's all clear in this expert's head. And through things like expert interviews, we capture those. The other one that we think is quite attractive is these things are called standard operating procedures. These document how a business actually operates. But here's the thing, they're distributed in a bunch of different places. You may have a standard operating procedure for this tiny piece of the process, and it's disconnected from other steps in the process. And putting the whole thing together is actually difficult. So there's some low-hanging fruit above and beyond interviews and trying to capture what's in somebody's head. There are some areas where we found tremendous success in gathering some of these decision boundaries, John.
Okay, so it sounds like it's not a completely solved problem, but there are ways. And you're right. Remember a lot of our consulting work. We use the transcripts and we can use that to mine out key statements that might be something that we could validate and use as a policy or we're actually gathering tacit knowledge. You're right. Standard operating procedures. I almost fell off my chair when I think about them. When I started work, there was a lot written down. But now in our digital age, very little is written down per se. And I see an interesting phenomenon happening where people are using AI to generate standard operating procedures. And then I think what you're saying is that we could use those same SOPs and that's a P, I said, but those SOPs and bring those back into the context window. So, yeah, no, it's
Yeah.
an interesting area. I just worry a little bit about the AI slop problem, right? Because as soon as somebody generates a standard operating procedure, unless they're meticulous and they make sure it's exactly right, then you're just feeding more garbage into the context window. And so I think it could be a very self-reinforcing bad way to to generate policy documents.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the truth of the matter is we're going about it in the wrong order if we're doing that. So you and I both know this, right? If you provide 40% or 50% of the picture, LLMs are absolutely fantastic improvisers, and they'll fill in the blanks. So when you're creating your standard, when the AI is taking too forward a role in creating a standard operating procedure, you're going to get improvisations that sound good but aren't good. So what we find is the right way to do this is to look at some of the existing standard operating procedures created by people, created by experts, complement them with interviews, expert interviews where necessary, and at that point in time, that's where the LLM would be a fantastic critic and provide you some insight as to perhaps what is missing. Based on its knowledge of the world that it was trained upon, are there some gaps? So that's where, if you're looking for how to actually begin the process, the stuff is literally hiding in plain sight. Some of it, that's the standard operating procedures. Some of it is locked in people's heads, but combining the two and using AI as a tool to enhance that actually works quite well.
So this reminds me of data governance discussions and general governance discussions where the concern, I'm from the data community, as most people know, and we've been trying to be effective at setting up governance of the quality of the information for a very long time. But, I think it becomes more and more acute, a problem, and it goes beyond just data. It goes into the content and the knowledge. And this reminds me of our knowledge management and our library sciences friends, probably have a lot to say about this as well. But before I take us too far afield, bring us back to other or any other topics that we want to cover as it relates to the context window, policies, decision boundaries. Do you want to talk about how it's even more important because they're agents, or was there other things you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. There's two things I want to do. I definitely want to wrap it up with why this is particularly important for agents, but I want to kind of so we've talked about filling the context window. I want to make it really clear what, based on our prognosis here, what should be in the context window. So obviously, there's the two bookends. We have the user request should be in at the top. Okay, and then we have the system information, whether it's tools that the LLM may have access to, etc. And then we have this thing in the middle. Today, it's filled with what I call concepts, the objects, the nouns, or at least predominantly. And the policies may be embedded in there somewhere, but they're not clear. What we're saying is the context window is filled by a user request, concepts, policies, and the system stuff. That's what goes into the context windows. That's what we call the minimum viable context, the right context at the right time at the right token budget. Now, coming back to agents, I mentioned this at the start, but ultimately, we know, we can see it, we hear about it with our clients that this agent economy is moving forward. This agent ecosystem in every enterprise is rapidly evolving. Yes, we have coding agents and we have quite a few of them, and they're incredibly successful. The next wave of agents are going to be those that are embedded deeply into the business processes of every enterprise. That's where we're going to get the hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of agents. So, at any time you have hundreds, thousands, or tens of thousands of anything, what we're talking about is a problem at scale. And you need to think differently. You need to think about the context window as something that can be repeatedly filled with the right stuff in a traceable, auditable fashion. And that's the part that we think is the minimum requirement as you're moving forward with your agent journey. The number of agents that are going to be in every enterprise says to us that you cannot get this wrong. This is table stakes in the agent ecosystem.
Okay, now just to close the loop, that reminds me of the post Jess Talisman put out maybe a week ago. She was saying you can't afford not to hire a knowledge engineer. And I think she's absolutely right for that reason. If you think about the abundance of what we're calling concepts and policies that exist in an enterprise, you need to treat that as a first class problem. And so I love that you've tied that together. And I look forward to talking about coding agents separately from enterprise business agents on our next podcast. Anything else, Eric, before we wrap the show up?
No, I think we covered it all, John. I think that's a wrap.
Okay. Well, see you next time. To be continued.